Okay, we're about to start section 3 called Moderate Treatment Effects Matter, and I'm going to give just a brief introduction, and I regret it, but I didn't make any slides, so you've got to bear with me. See if I can actually read this. I should note that getting here was not easy from the United States, but it's a real pleasure to be here at the celebration of such an important person. As part of getting ready, I scanned some of the literature, which is so easy to do nowadays, and noted a few things that are interesting, at least in part because they're so in sync with current interest. I don't know how much this has come here, but the United States is obsessed with real-world data, by which they mean not clear what they mean. But many of the things that Richard was pushing are closely related to that. Simplifying the conduct of trials, not collecting data that doesn't really matter that much, applying broad inclusion criteria, everybody's for that. And of course you really do want to know about all people and even people on other drugs and people with milder disease. You do want to know all that. Seeking modest but still critical effects. After all, you get 50% reductions in some things in oncology or in something, but in cardiovascular medicine, it's a good day if you get a 10% reduction in mortality. And he also made use of meta-analyses to try to figure out how to design the studies. All of these are very much on people's mind. The interest in dealing with subgroups is also a matter of great interest, and it's worth noting that in many of the trials that Richard was part of, there was plenty of subgroup looking. He just wanted you to be cautious about believing it too much. Anyway, in ISIS-2, for example, which I looked up, there were all kinds of modern things. It was a factorial study. We don't see nearly enough of those, but you really do want to know how and whether drugs interact. It looked closely at effects over time and looked at the effect of when you started the treatment, very important. And it looked at those subgroups, the subgroups that were defined by when you started the therapy, and there were some important findings, not as much as some people had thought there were going to be. And it was big enough to assess mortality, which a lot of trials these days don't do, because the trial would have to have 18,000 people in it, and they don't want to do that. And then, of course, although it presented 50 or 60 subgroups, I have the paper with me, it also presented the most famous subgroup rebuttal ever, the astrological signs. Whereas people in certain signs had no effect and the other people did have an effect. That was not to assert that that was true. It was to assert that subgroups can be ridiculous and you should be very careful. It's probably the most quoted subgroup rebuttal I've ever been aware of. That's not to say that sometimes you don't find important subgroups. At least ones that we as FDA have believed. We believe that Bidil works in blacks, but not particularly well in whites. There's 2 good VA studies that show that, and the label indicates it only for the black population. The antiplatelet drug ticagrelor, given in people after a heart attack, didn't work at all in the US compared to clopidogrel. It was inferior, but it was superior everywhere else. We eventually decided that was because high doses of aspirin were used in the United States. So the subgroup effect, made us feel good. So they're not never, you just have to be cautious. Anyway, it is worth saying how much what he did so many years ago fits with current interest. ISIS was a trial that was done in a real-world environment using information that's ordinarily collected, death and stuff like that. It was done largely in the healthcare system. It was not very disruptive. And it got at the critical measures, but not the others, many of which were collected in the course of healthcare. So there is a strong movement to see if people can do trials more readily What the conflict is that a lot of people who offer this kind of hope want to use epidemiologic studies, but of course, Richard's studies were still rigorous and randomized, and that's what we all hope. I wanted to make one last pitch. And that is, there was a lot of discussion about how we're not doing as well on treating certain diseases as others. And one of my obsessions, but without any effect on anybody to date, is finding out why people stop therapy. The last figures I saw say that 50% of people started on an antihypertensive are no longer on it at the end of a year. There have been some improvements in some places. Cleveland Clinic tried to mediate that. And you see similar reports of people starting statins, that half of them are off them by the end of a year. That, to me, is probably the major public health problem in the United States. These are all treatments that have profound effects on survival and other consequences. And I think there ought to be active research on how to make people stay on it, whether it's giving them lottery tickets or obsessing them or having their wives yell at them. I don't know, but there are very few controlled trials on this. So that's my pitch for an area that people ought to be more interested in.